Everyone, I'm Val Hawkins, Chair of Agenda Alexandria. In our 24th season, Agenda Alexandria is our community's premier organization that explores the issues that our city faces without taking sides. In fact, our motto is taking a look without taking sides. Agenda Alexandria has just produced and released a very timely podcast prior to the upcoming election. Gerrymandering Amendment 1. Your ballot this fall has an amendment that will change how districts are drawn in Virginia for the General Assembly and for Congress. Board members Michael Lee Pope and Aaliyah Gaskins have just produced a very illuminating podcast. You may listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other popular platforms. Today, we have a very special program of interest to our community. Reviewing the Police, a discussion of the concept of civilian review, which is being considered by City Council. Special thanks to our program sponsors for the year, Simpson Development, Homes of Alexandria of Compass, the Zebra newspaper, our gold sponsor, Oscar Fitzgerald, and our sustaining contributors, Ricardo Alfaro, Linda and Steve App, Russell Bailey, Dave Baker, former police chief, Janet Barnett of Synergy Home Care, Jay Hoffman of Hoffman Properties, Kit Leiter, and Anna Leiter, Pat Miller, and David Speck. We would also like to thank our board members who have worked to organize and execute our program today. Michael Lee Pope, who is the committee leader and moderator today, Aaliyah Gaskins, Janet Barnett, Jeannie Theismann, and Shad Thomas. And special thanks to Ricardo Alfaro, our vice chair and producer of this program. And finally, we're most appreciative of our great panelists who've graciously given their time and thought to address this important subject. Michael will introduce them after this message.
Welcome back to Agenda Alexandria. We're so glad to see you again virtually. One day we will meet in person again, I'm sure. But for now, we're meeting virtually, and it's really glad to see you virtually. I'm also really honored and pleased to have a dynamite panel today to talk about the proposal for a citizen review board, the Alexandria Police Department. We're really pleased to be joined by the Chief of Police in Alexandria, Michael Brown. Chief Brown, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Michael. Thank you.
We are also joined by the legislative director for the city of Alexandria. It happens to be her birthday today, so happy birthday to Sarah Graham Taylor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
We are also joined by an organizer with tenants and workers, Ingris Moran. Ingris, thanks for joining us. I didn't hear you there. You might be on mute.
Thank you for having me. Sorry.
Great. No, that's fine. And we're also joined by the co-executive director of New Virginia Majority, John Liss. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Considering the events of this morning, I want to throw it right to the chief of police. What can you tell us, Chief, about what happened this morning, and give us the latest?
Well, thank you, Michael. We had an incident that occurred in Old Town at the Holiday Inn. We got called to a call for shots fired. While investigating that particular case, two of our officers encountered an individual who was running from the scene. There was some gunfire. Our officer was wounded. Thankfully, he was transported to George Washington Hospital and is being released. He survived that. We were very blessed with that. And subsequent to that, we had another incident involving the suspect where we he fired on our officers yet again in Old Town at a construction site, and we were able to secure the area, and we appreciate the local community support in trying to stay out of the area while this is going on. And unfortunately, that individual was pronounced dead as a result of some wounds. We don't know if they are related for us or someone else. The Virginia State Police is investigating our shots fired situations, as they have done as an independent investigation. And the investigation as to the original crime continues as we speak. In fact, I've been checking my phones based upon a lot of things that have been taking place prior to this call. And if I happen to look at the phone, that's what I'm doing, is trying to monitor that as well.
One citizen review board. You've seen one citizen review board, right? Because they all work differently. So you can't explain them all to us, but give us kind of an overview. What is the range of different kinds of citizen review boards and how they work?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And just to give you all a kind of a better feel for why me, I am the city's legislative director, but during the interim, I was tasked with working on the proposal and the draft ordinance and all the research that went into putting together the initial discussion about what a community police review board would look like in Alexandria. So that was my other duty as assigned during the summer. And so I'm happy to speak with you all about that from a kind of a subject matter research place. But you're right. I mean, that line that if you've seen one community police review board, you've seen one community police review board. And while there are models and best practices and principles and standards and guidelines that are out there that can help us make a community police review board successful, there's no one single model and no one set of duties or authorities that will fit the need of every community. And so the goal is to figure out what problem you are trying to solve in your community and figure out what model works best for your community. And in general, they're generally accepted 4 models of civilian oversight of law enforcement. The first model is an investigative model, where the board would take a complaint, conduct their own investigation, and render a conclusion. The second model is a peer review model, where the board reviews completed police internal affairs investigations. So investigations that are already done by the police department, once they're completed, the board would then review them and offering their recommendations regarding the findings and the outcomes of the internal investigation. The third model is an auditing model, where a board would examine sort of broader patterns when it comes to complaints and investigations, including patterns in the quality of investigations, the findings, the outcomes, the discipline, and would then make recommendations based on those sort of broader findings of the system rather than the individual investigations. And the final model is sort of that squishy hybrid model, where parts and pieces of each of these, the investigative model, the review model, the auditing model, would be brought together in a combination that would be unique to the community that's looking to implement it, in order to achieve that balance of those three roles in the way that the oversight is demanded or expected by the community that is implementing the board. And so that's really what the city is working on now, is figuring out what model or what combination works best for the city. And then there's other specifics that you need to figure out. But the first step is to sort of figure out what model and what hybridization of those models works for Alexandria.
Chief, when this idea was initially brought up for the city council earlier this year, your reaction was that the review board was a phrase. The phrase review board had a very negative connotation. It's considered a threatening title. Explain what you meant by that. Why is this threatening? What exactly is the connotation of review board?
I appreciate that question, Michael, because I think in some respects the context was lost on what I was trying to say. Policing has always had some level of review going back to 150 years, and it's more formalized, and that's the discussion they want to have. And frankly, we're open to that, and I'm very supportive of review and oversight. We are a very transparent agency. We push a lot of stuff out there that many of our other similar agencies don't. So I'm not afraid of oversight. The concern I had at that point in time is at that time we were in the middle of a national narrative against police. And when you look at policing as a whole, there are problematic police officers, there are problematic agencies. I do not believe the Alexandria Police Department is one of those. Can we certainly improve? Absolutely. But I didn't want to have something put out there that the officers, would be concerned about in terms of they don't trust me. And maybe they don't. And if that's the case, we need to look at it. If a review board will get us there, that's fine. But the issue is really words matter in the law enforcement business, just like they matter in the discussions of things like race, everything else that we have to have. And so that's the point of all that comment. It's not that we're afraid of oversight. We've had oversight. We will continue to have oversight. And how it's constructed is really not the police department's role. It's just we have to be able to, as Sir Robert Peel said, we are the public and the public are us. And without it, we don't get our job done. Simple as that.
Does the police department have a preferred model? Sarah walked through the different models. I'm wondering, do you guys have a recommendation or preference?
Well, we actually gave Sarah our ideas. We brought our command staff together, and I vetted it with our labor associations, the ones representing the rank and file folks. And we had a kind of a discussion about the things that we think might get us there. Not everything was put in there that we accepted in a deliberative fashion. And Sarah came up with some ones that we didn't even think about, which we were fine with. The key issue for me is I really am agnostic about an auditor position or a hybrid position or even a review position. The one I'm concerned about is the investigatory one, and I will tell you why. It's not because we're afraid of an independent investigator. It's a legal issue. Because if you get into situations, for example, that you violate garrity rules or other kinds of rules related, if we get collective bargaining, where you can't get the facts of a case because of people doing it the wrong way, you may not be able to do criminal prosecution and the like. As a police agency, we need to get the facts of how things went, and the facts will tell us what we need to do procedurally and otherwise. And there's a very fine line about what we can do as an employer. We can compel testimony. If you issue a subpoena to somebody, they can evoke their Fifth Amendment right. And when you do that, you sometimes run into all sorts of legal and constitutional issues. Now, if the folks that set up an independent review are able to understand that and not step on those, we may not jeopardize situations where we have discipline. We may not jeopardize the potential of any kind of a criminal prosecution. That's my concern about the investigative piece. I will also tell you some experiences I've had with other agencies who have gone down that road. Many of them have been in that situation from time to time. Not every time, but from time to time.
John, let me throw it to you. What would you like to see in a review board? What does this newly created body need to accomplish?
Force. And yet it's for those exceptions that I think you need to have something that's independent and that has subpoena power, the ability to do independent investigation, with all respect to not a union contract or whatever, confidential or whatever else, but it be some kind of independent investigation. Not of when I was more active directly in the Alexandria neighborhood, there was pretty regular. In fact, every Monday at the weekend, there would be people lined up outside my door about different levels of police. I'll say many cases, and that there was 3 cases actually where people were killed. And it sure would have been nice to have had an independent review to sort of go through that, maybe clearing the officers, but I think in some cases it seemed pretty clear that there was abuse.
Ingris, let me throw it to you. So we've seen several different we're talking about several different models here. The sort of concurrent investigations where the police are conducting an investigation and the citizens are also conducting an investigation, and they're sort of concurrent. In other words, they're going on at the same time, but in different rooms by different people. Then there's like a hybrid model where they're sort of interconnected with the police and the civilians sort of working together. And then there's also another model where in certain circumstances where the civilians would do the investigation and the oversight and sort of take it out of the hands of police for certain kinds of cases, abuse of authority, that sort of thing. What's your thought, Ingris, about sort of what kind of a review board you would like to see?
Sure, thank you. And so as Tenants and Workers United, we have always worked on issues that are directly impacting our community, not just the Latinx, but the Black community, immigrant, young people. And so we're working on a lot on police accountability. And so that is our major issue that we see with police accountability and the issues that the treatment that we see in the police department, not just here in Alexandria, but really how there is a really gray area where we feel that as communities of color feel that the police department should be more answerable to the people and should be held accountable when it comes to certain issues. And I know we always go back to what's happening at the national level, but I think this is a great opportunity to see the city of Alexandria really have something that does indeed have civilian oversight, have subpoena power, really have that investigative authority, because I think that's what our community is really looking forward to and seeing how we can improve that trust. And by trust, it means holding each other accountable.
Sarah, so we've heard from John Liss, we've heard from Ingris Moran. Both of them would like to see subpoena power. If looking at other police citizen review boards across the country, and even here in Virginia, do most of them have subpoena power? Talk a little bit about subpoena power and how they sort of fit into these kinds of review boards.
So what the chief mentioned about the legal implications of subpoena power is certainly one of the things that we are trying to figure out how to deal with. The subpoena power was only just now granted to localities who implement community police review boards in the legislation that was passed during this past special session. And I would note that legislation has a 1 July effective date. So any locality that looks to implement a community police review board with subpoena power wouldn't be able to do so until 1 July. Alexandria has the reading of the authority that we have in our charter to say that we have subpoena power as a locality, and that subpoena power we could extend just as as council has it, as departments have it, that we could then extend it to our police review board. So we would not have to wait until 1 July to do a police review board with subpoena power based on our reading of the authority that we currently have under our charter. That's just beyond that. Subpoena power is sort of one of those things that it's in some places, it's not in other places. It is chosen in some places and not chosen in other places, even when they have authority in states that don't have to ask for authority from their assemblies. But one of the things that I found in my research was that most oversight bodies that have subpoena power, including places like Berkeley and San Francisco, are actually prohibited from undertaking any investigation until any pending criminal charges against an officer have been adjudicated, or unless they receive permission from their district attorney, or in our case, our Commonwealth's attorney, to proceed with the investigation. And the other thing about subpoena power that the chief sort of briefly mentioned is that under the Garrity rules, police officers and employees in general are required to participate in investigations as part of their employment. That is how it works. And subpoena power then generally either can conflict with that requirement, where they could then ask, call upon their Fifth Amendment, the right to not incriminate themselves, or the subpoena power is generally used to compel complainants, witnesses, folks from the community. And so the optics of the use of subpoena power against folks in the community in these investigations is something that needs to be considered. That subpoena power isn't necessary to compel employees or folks within the city to participate, but it would be used for potentially complainants or witnesses or other folks in the community, not just for their own participation, but for the compelling of documents, of videos. It could be used to subpoena somebody's Ring camera. It could be used to compel somebody's Facebook page or their phone records or things like that. So that's the thing about subpoena power that's really kind of has to be looked at in the balance of what is it that you are hoping to achieve with that subpoena power, and can you achieve it without it? And if not, then it's something you want to you want to go into. As we're working on this, I'm actually looking at my little draft PowerPoint over here as I'm sort of going through this, is that there are the models that we've talked about, and then there are things that need to be decided as you're talking about the models, subpoena power being one of them. Whether or not disciplinary authority is binding is another one. And these are all things that were discussed in the special session legislation that now we have you may do this, and now it's incumbent upon us to decide what it is within that, that authority that we want to implement here. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Sarah, I'm glad you brought up disciplinary authority, because I do want to come back to that. But before we move on from subpoena power, let's just stay on subpoena power for now. John Liss. Also, I want this to be an open conversation too. So if you want to jump in, if anyone wants to jump in, just sort of wave your hand around and we'll get to you. So John Liss, what do you make of this idea that the optics might actually be really bad of subpoena power, because you wouldn't be issuing subpoenas to police officers, you'd be issuing subpoenas to witnesses and victims of crime, or victims in general, or citizens. And what do you make of that? The optics of subpoenaing citizens and witnesses might be bad.
After the internal review, but it's really, how do you get at the truth? How do you get a multi-sided view of what happened, get at the truth, and get it out there to the public, and do it in a way that, look, no matter, even the best internal investigation is always going to be, in my mind, the fox guarding the chicken coop. I mean, it's somebody who's of the office who, is in the same building there, basically investigating. How do you get it outside there? It's one of the most important departments outside of schools. I think it's the largest department that we've got. Large, $60, $70 million budget here in the city of Alexandria, 300 plus officers. I think it just makes sense. And I don't know exactly where the gradation is about every case, but I know allegations around race and gender, racism, sexism, cases that result in death, all those things definitely merit a potential investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of when we're looking at these, we're not looking to have a board, and I think that the chief will, can concur on this. We're not looking for a board that investigates, whether or not someone was late for work, or whether or not someone misused their computer and was watching Netflix, at work. We're looking at to create a board that's really focused on, these big areas, and the areas that get into the systemic issues, not just the individual incidents. That by investigating these incidents, you sort of get at these bigger things. And so we have like a little laundry list of the things that we sort of see fall into this area of abuse of authority and those big areas. It's deliberate application or use of unnecessary, unreasonable, or excessive force. Unjustified use or display of force or unnecessary escalation of charges, theft of personal property, the use of abusive racial, ethnic, or sexual language or gestures, harassment or discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, ancestry, national origin, marital status, familial status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity. I mean, that's really, I think, what we're hoping to come to with this model. The question is, how does the model fit with does anything that fall into that category immediately come away from the police department and have a separate investigation under this board? If something comes up in that, does the policing auditor get inserted into an internal investigation to then be able to be a part of what's going on and bring information and intelligence back to the board for their involvement and their engagement? I think that's really sort of what we're trying to put together as a balance of finding out, not only investigating these individual things, which clearly is important and needs to be done, and needs to be done in an open, transparent way, but also getting at what are we learning from this, and how can we take what we're learning from this to then recommend and implement changes in policing. And going back to the language choice that the chief sort of briefly mentioned at the beginning, that's one of the things that we've been really thinking about, is the careful parsing of the words that we are choosing when we talk about this. There is a difference between a police review board and a policing review board. One is people, one is practices. There's a difference between oversight and review, and they may be nuanced differences, but when you're talking about what it is the community is expecting from this board, as well as what the police officers and civilian staff at the police department get from the words that we are choosing, it's something that we're really trying to be thoughtful about as we're moving this forward.
On that issue, I'll throw it to, I just want to come back to you, Chief, but on that issue, what the community is expecting, I was going to ask Ingris, what is the community expecting?
The community is expecting to be heard, and not just being heard, but have their thoughts taken into practice. And I think as an organization, we're always in spaces and conversations where we're just being heard, but nothing is happening after that, right? Like we want, many times we were pushing for the ordinance a few years ago, and we see some steps here and there, but we want action steps. And I think this is a good opportunity to have transparency to be shown, to have true conversations and true practices and results, and our people be part of it, and our communities of color be in these conversations and have the authority. And I think that's where we want to be at, and really have that oversight and have there be results that are more equitable when it comes to police practice by the least.
And Ingris, what do you make of this criticism that subpoena power might actually be a bad thing, because you would be issuing subpoenas to witnesses and citizens, and not police officers or police people in law enforcement? What do you make of that criticism?
I think at this point, our community members just want truth. They want answers. And so I think this overall is going to be a good opportunity, at least have that first step, to see how we can have our community be in control, have more community control, and see what's really going on in the city of Alexandria. Do we need all the resources that we're placing in the police department? Are there more resources that could be implemented in other agencies across the city of Alexandria, such as mental health? And so I think this is a good step that we're going to, but I think as a community, we really do want to hold those in power accountable. And that's something that we're always seeking, to how our people in the community that are mostly directly impacted by policing, there can be a better space for them to be in these conversations.
Chief, you mentioned earlier there might be some legal issues with the Citizen Review Board having subpoena power, and I'm not sure that I fully understand that. What would be the potential problems or pitfalls there?
It's what Sarah was kind of talking about with the Garrity decision and some of the other decisions in terms of investigative compelling of testimony. As an employer, as she pointed out, we can ask to respond to a question and compel them to do it so we can get to the facts. Now, that cannot be used in a subsequent criminal proceeding or any extension of that. And that's because we're the employer. If you get into situations where it's not an employer or issuing of a subpoena or things of that nature, then you may be avoid running into a Garrity conflict. And if the information is provided and it's not done properly, and it was considered to be compelled testimony in court, then if you tried to do some criminal prosecution later on, it'd be fruit of the poisonous tree. You wouldn't be able to use it. So those are legal issues in an investigatory thing that we have to consider whenever we do internal investigations. An example of that is when we do our shootings, and talking about, to John's point about an independent investigation, I share his view about major uses of force. That's why we have the Virginia State Police. In fact, they're there today investigating the incident that took place this morning, because they do the criminal investigation independently, and we do not do the administrative investigation until they're done, so that we do not run into any potential criminal prosecutorial problems, should there be any. Not that I envision one happening anytime soon, but it could happen. We're also working with the Northern Virginia chiefs to deal with, come up with a memorandum of understanding to create a similar thing for independent review for major incidents, not just shootings, so that we can deal with some of these other issues. Because every one of us, if you're really into being a professional police officer or chief in particular, wants to make sure that we do it in an independent manner so it doesn't get tainted by whether or not it looks like it's going to be some internal cover-up of some type. Now, what I'm concerned about in managing the police department is making sure that we do an independent review of what's taking place to make sure our policies and procedures are accurate, that the training that we're doing is proper, that the employees are in fact following those procedures and that training, because that's a responsibility that the management team here in the police department has in terms of managing the police department. And I would hate to see that be abdicated by us and saying, well, it's somebody else's problem, we don't have to worry about it. We do have to worry about it because we're professionals and we need to be able to do that independently, regardless of whether we have a review board or not.
John or Ingrid, do you have any responses to that?
I think for us, it's just like I said, and it's having our people be part of the conversation and take and really be part of the conversation. That's where we're, as an organization, we've always seek to actually there be results. And for example, I know police data transparency has always been something that we've been pushing for, not just in reaction to what has been going on, but to know that not all the data exists here in the city of Alexandria. I know we're, after pushing for many years, we were able to get the traffic, just the pedestrian stops, but to know that we actually have a policy in place, which is why we're having the conversation. I think that's very important to know that, to take advantage of this policy so that way our folks can be part of this conversation. And so I think it won't be perfect, but I think through trial and error and just taking the steps and just starting it, we'll find out. But I overall agree that there should be subpoena, there should be investigative power, there should be civilian oversight where our people who are more prone to be policed to be in these conversations and take a role in that.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Ingrid just explained. And I would step back and say, I think there's a bigger conversation here around policing and community safety that I think is this is a small piece that's important, but as I think we would all agree, there's been less sort of blatant incidents over the last decade and the last 5 years, I would say, than there was 15 years ago or 12 years ago. And so for me, it's like school resource officers having police in the schools, what kind of environment does that create? It's less the money. It's more about who do you want to have in our schools and the interface with students. Number two is we're discussing here, oversight and review. Number three, and I'm not saying defund the police like they're going to take $70 million and, well, maybe we could shift it to some nonprofits. No, just kidding. But I'm not saying we're going to pull $70 million out, but it's like, are there ways we can do things more efficiently? Are there some things that are better done by others? So I would look at, so if you look back and said, how many incidents, and I don't know how many they are, but how many are from mental health? How many are in mental health and don't involve weapon or immediate physical harm? I mean, there are certain things that police, frankly, do better and are trained for. There are certain things that a mental health professional could indeed do better. Or even if you look at the number of traffic stops, which disproportionately affect particularly Black Alexandria, or Black folks driving while Black in Alexandria, it's like, is there a way to pull some of that traffic monitoring function out of the police? And you know, again, if people are speeding, you got to over that you get a ticket. But how do you not turn that as an open the door investigation for who knows what, fishing trips to some extent? So I would say let's step back and look at these broader things. I think we've got a good baseline. I agree with Ingrid about the need for independent investigation, but it's all and community participation. But one of the things we can reflect and actually create Alexandria as a model, because I think we have enough lines of communications, including this forum, where we can talk about what's best done by the police, what's best done elsewhere, how do we balance these resources to sort of make that stuff happen.
Okay, I saw Chief Brown raise his hand. I also saw Sarah Taylor raise her hand. So we'll start with the Chief and then move to Sarah Taylor.
But thank you, Michael. I do agree with both John and Ingrid. So one of the things that comes out of my research in terms of the review board, especially from the National Association for Law Enforcement Oversight, was that you need to have community input into all these kinds of conversations. And even in the policing field, we see the same thing with the National Police Foundation and some of these others, these research tools that are saying that that dialogue needs to take place. And I'm more than willing to do it, and we've been doing it for some time, and we can always improve on that. The other piece, though, I think that's also important to to point out is that the systematic thing, John, that you're presenting, I think, is incredibly important in this business. And an example of that is the mental health issue. When I first came on, we didn't respond to the same level of mental health calls that we do today. And part of it is because we're the only ones that are really, for the most part, except for fire, doing 24/7, on-duty stuff. So we got stuck with it. And we have a number of things that are systematic in the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia and the statutes like domestics, where if you're in a covered relationship, that officer has zero discretion as to what's going to take place depending upon what the facts are. Those kinds of things we've been complaining about as a profession across this country for decades. In fact, tomorrow, there's going to be a city council meeting addressing the mental health issue because we've been working with DCHS on some alternative approaches to doing that as opposed to just sending a cop out there all the time. Because I really don't think you're going to get the treatment from the cop if you have mental health issues. We're just trying to resolve a crisis. So I'm all in on those kinds of alternatives because I think we should be looking at those. Absolutely.
Sarah?
Super, super important on this. And that's why one of the reasons when council said back in May, you have 90 days to come back to us with a proposal for a community police review board. And it was handed to me as my summer project. I got really, really nervous because all my research and everything that I looked at said that a community police review board needs to be responsive to the needs and the concerns and the perceptions and the problems in the community it's going to serve. And that means it needs to be built on the engagement of local stakeholders and robust community input, not just on the research side of it, which is why when we put this together, we didn't put it together as here's what staff wants to do, up or down vote from council with a public hearing in the middle. Our goal is to put together a proposal that would then go out for robust community input. And anyone who hasn't to this point been touched by me or whoever's been working on this, that it will go out for this real robust community input, because otherwise it's not truly responsive, even in its inception, in what it looks like and what it feels like. It's not. The community isn't part of that piece of it. And to then say, well, then they'll get to serve on it. It's like, no. They have to be part of this, the production of it, of making sure that it gets at all the problems and the perceptions and the concerns of the community. And so that's why that's the, once we have a draft, it's going to go out for that, that input. And I think the other thing too about this board is it's not just about investigations. It's about looking at police policies and training and other systemic issues, not just looking at individual incidents. It's the goal is to also sort of look deeper into the system, because like John said, we don't have a lot of big, ugly, horrible, terrible incidents that we need to take out from behind the curtain and shine the bright light of day on. What probably is even more relevant to our community is looking at the system and the little things that are part of the system that might allow these systemic problems to continue, and to figure out how to fix those, whether or not we're talking about big specific incidents. And the last thing I wanted to mention was there was a lot of really, really good legislation that passed during this special session. And I think some of the things that are going to come out of that are going to help us make decisions, or quite frankly, force us to make decisions. The Marcus Alert bill that would create these crisis response teams with law enforcement support, but really focused on mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse response to things that are not law enforcement problems, but to this point have only had a law enforcement response. So the Marcus Alert bill is one. I mean, there's data transparency and reporting bills. There was bills, about what you can and can't stop people for now, things dangling from your rearview mirror, or loud exhausts, or highly tinted windows are no longer things that you can stop people for. And they were things that were generally used against young people, people of color, and folks in our community who tend to be over policed. So to take those things off the table starts to sort of clear the water a little bit to get at what are these real problems that we need to be addressing in our policing, in our police, in our budget, in our the decisions that we make on the system side, as to how we do what we do with our resources and with our staff and with these choices we're making.
So Sarah mentioned robust community input. Let's get some robust community input right here on Agenda Alexandria. Ingris, let me go to you. So if we're looking at different models of what a citizen review board might look like, there's the sort of concurrent model where you got these two separate investigations. The police are doing their police investigation. We've got a separate citizen review that's going on, sort of different people in different buildings doing the same thing essentially, but looking at the same thing, but doing their own separate concurrent think of them as two separate tracks. That's, one model. Then there's this hybrid model where they're working together. Then there's this other model where the citizens are doing the investigation of like abuse of authorities, the list that Sarah was talking about earlier, the excessive force. Ingris, what do you think might be the best model?
I think as a model, I think it's not so much which one, but I think how much voice the community it has in this conversation. So whether it's the concurrent or investigative, I think those either would be ideal for the communities and the community members we've been speaking about on what their thoughts are, right? Not just making decisions as organizations, but really listening to the people. But overall, like I said, as an organization, this is a secondary issue. And one of the things that we always see is unfortunate to know that we always want the city to be proactive, but it's unfortunate that we have to do things in reaction to the legislation that is happening at the General Assembly, right? And so we're always working with the local government, seeing what we can push for, what policies we can actually put in place. And even in our school system, right, trying to remove SROs. And now we're seeing more input because that's an obligation that they have to do based on state legislation, right? And so we just want to be heard, but also listening to us and have those voices be put into policies, into not just resolutions, but true policy. And so I think overall, policing is, there's always going to be problems in policing that are connected to race, gender, and other issues. And so I always claim that have the people be put in these conversations and be the stakeholders, be the decision makers in this conversation. I think it's everything in terms of policing has always been like a political process and not so much a true grassroots process. And so I overall just think that this is just an opportunity and this is a time to actually take action.
John, what are your thoughts on the best model, the concurrent model, the hybrid model, the model where the citizens totally take over the investigation? Do you have any thoughts on what might be the best model?
So what I learned and heard today is, I guess, because of employee rules, there's a state police or the local police are going to do some kind of internal review. I understand that. And it seems like after that, I would be for an independent, something housed separately. Could you draw from that data, but could also bring in new data to sort of evaluate the case. And again, it's not for every case, but it's for either big, broad trend lines, particularly around race and race and policing, gender and policing, sexuality and policing, as well as around specific cases. Again, we haven't had a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, but you never know. So
you're thinking concurrent model then is what I'm hearing you say.
I thought a sequence, the way I heard is that legally there appears to be some reasons why the police needed to be doing that. Yeah, I guess it's concurrent model. You're right. But there's an independent one done at the community, at the behest of the community, and not responsive to the police department per se.
Question from our former board member, Bruce Johnson. Hey, Bruce. It's good to see you again virtually. I'll just throw this open to the panel, anyone who wants to talk to it. Bruce Johnson says he'd be interested in some discussion of the possible size, composition, tenure, sort of who's going to be on this panel, how long are they going to be on it, sort of what kind of people we're thinking about would be the best fit. Any thoughts from anybody on the panel?
I mean, the original draft that we put together when it came to composition was that it would be a 7-member board, and that it would include some specific some seats on the board that were and I don't have the draft in front of me. I apologize. It had 2 or 3 seats that were specifically held for folks who are residents and from groups that are traditionally over-policed, for lack of a clearer term. And so there were a couple of seats related to for those folks. There were a seat held for someone who works for a social racial justice organization. There was a seat held for someone who works in mental, behavioral health, substance abuse. And one of the things that came down from the legislature in the Community Police Review Board legislation was that the boards may have a member with someone who is retired law enforcement or is a retiree of, with law enforcement experience, not from the community that the board would serve, but that member would have to be a non-voting member, an ex officio member, where you would get their subject matter expertise and their experience, but they would not have a vote on the board. We had a couple things in there about, you can't be a candidate for office, you can't be an elected official, there's a bunch of other things, but the goal was to have it, to earmark some seats for people with specific areas of personal experience or subject matter experience, along with other, some other general members of the community.
I know one of the issues the General Assembly was grappling with when they were discussing the legislation on civilian review boards is the role of law enforcement officers. So like current law enforcement officers, that they might be prohibited from being on one of these panels. Mm-hmm. Then there was some discussion about former law enforcement officers. Do you want former law enforcement officers? Chief Brown, what kinds of people would you like to see on this board? What kinds of people do you think would be appropriate to have on a board like this?
Well, we weighed in and gave our thoughts in the development of this, and to some extent, what Sarah outlined in her proposal covered, again, a lot of the concerns we had. She added some others that we didn't think about in this case. That was an example of what I'm talking about as far as membership. The biggest issue in order for us to have credibility is to have people on the board that at least are appreciative and objective as to the context of policing. That includes everything that John and Ingris has talked about, but also what the officers are doing every day. And part of that is an educational piece. Part of that may be, the perspective of someone on the board who's a non-voting member, like Sarah laid out, that can give that flavor of context, because this particular job is incredibly difficult and complex in its own right. And so you need to understand that and to even identify the problematic areas that may be systemic. And so we would encourage that whoever gets selected to have a sincere interest in bridging the gap between the community and policing, make sure that gap is minimized as much as possible. And we would be pleased and happy to provide some additional training so that the board members would have an understanding of what it is we do, why we do it. They could ask any question. We try to be as transparent as possible. We push all of our policies, for example, out there where everyone could see them. And so the issue there is that establishes credibility for the policing agency. My biggest fear in policing is that if we don't establish credibility both ways, both with the community and with the policing, you end up with people trying to go underground, whether it's the community or the police. And that's not going to be healthy for that relationship that I think we all want to have.
John, Ingris, any thoughts in terms of what kinds of people would be appropriate to be on this panel, or also what kind of people you would want to exclude and not have be part of this panel?
Sounds generally pretty good. I like people that are committed or connected to organizations. So I would just name it as, and in Alexandria, Tenants and Workers United, the NAACP are probably the two places that people would most likely go to if they had an incident. And I think our art should be structurally built into it. If a former police officer is there, is like providing some level of context and perspective, I don't think that's a problem. And then I would just step back and say, with all, this is not specific to the Civilian Review Board, but overall, boards and commissions in the city have a strong class race bias to it in terms of, when is it held, level of formal education needed, it's conducted in, is there child care provided? I mean, just go through the list. So if you look at all the powerhouse commissions, of which this potentially could be comparable, planning and zoning, et cetera, those ones are stacked up with essentially folks from the legal profession, development professionals, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say, how do we keep this one both thorough, authentic, directly connected, but also rooted enough in real everyday people that it isn't up here in the stratosphere, but actually letting people view with their own eyes who are from impacted communities in particular.
Ingris, any thoughts about what kind of people would be appropriate to?
I definitely agree with John with making it authentic and really, really rooting into the people who live in Alexandria, everyday people, working class folks, and that including people from the Arlanda Chirilawa community, the West End, which is very diverse, including organizations that are truly working with those directly impacted folks from the LGBTQIA community, and those who are mostly are at risk of and every day being policed. And
I think we might have temporarily lost Ingris. Okay, so looking at the clock, we're pushing up against our 1 o'clock end time, which is a bummer. Normally, when we meet in person, we get to meet a little bit longer, but considering our virtual world that we're living in, we're sort of limited to an hour. So I wanted to return to this issue that we kind of touched on earlier about disciplinary authority. So this was specifically mentioned in the legislation that these boards would have the potential to have disciplinary authority. So if there's a problem, you might demote an officer that might have made a mistake. You might even fire an officer that has made a sort of mistake as it relates to this board. I'll throw it to John Liss. Is it important for this Civilian Review Board to have disciplinary authority?
I'll partly kick it to Sarah, who's done her comprehensive review. My general orientation is that you want to have more power in the community, and that disciplinary power is part of that. But I also want to see what's best practices out there in the bigger universe. And I'd say beyond Virginia, which has had a lot of limits, but I think there's a lot of other cities with Cincinnati, San Francisco, where they've had sort of longer experience.
I see that we're joined by Ingris again. It's good to see you again.
sorry,
We're talking about the potential for this board to have disciplinary authority to maybe like demote an officer who has, there would be a finding of wrongdoing and then the disciplinary authority. So like demote or even fire. Is it, for Ingris, is it important from your perspective that the Citizen Review Board have disciplinary authority?
I believe it should have. I think we already have many groups and many spaces where we can provide our recommendations, and I think this is what would make it unique to be in this this oversight group. And so I think that there should be that opportunity to do so.
Chief, what are your thoughts on this? So, like, she used the word recommendation, but the authority would go beyond just recommendation. It would be like under one model, the Citizen Review Board would be able to demote or fire. It wouldn't just be a recommendation. It would be like, this is happening. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, this is another example of where the language really, really matters. Disciplinary action is a function of an employer. This is an independent group, not an employer. If they get into the discussion of these kinds of things in discipline, then you have to have a review process, a process where they can appeal up to, in the city, up to 6 levels, which means that in this particular case, if we use the same appeal process, the findings and the decision of the constituted board can be overturned at any one of those levels, up to and including before the court. And maybe just you might not want to have the board placed in that position where they're told that what they're doing is improper. My decision, for example, as a department director can be overruled, and personnel can be overruled at all the steps along the way to give that employee the due process that they're entitled to do. The fact that they have disciplinary authority doesn't relieve under statute and under employee law the opportunity for the employee to have review. One of the things that I've seen in some of the research, and Sarah and I have talked about a couple of departments, where you get into these, sometimes that disciplinary process takes a long time. And there's a frustration when it's owned by a review board of some type as far as managing their expectations. The decision comes out, it may take a long time before that decision is finally adjudicated in a review process. So again, it's not, for me, the bigger issue is what's going to be the best for the department, for the city, and where do you place that employer-employee relationship? And I would advocate that the system that we have right now is well-tuned, there's a body of law behind it, and I would just hate for the board to become disenchanted with the fact that they get overruled at some point in this process, and it could happen.
All right, so we're pushing up against our 1 p.m. deadline, so we have to sort of wrap up. For final thoughts, I'll sort of go around the board here in terms of the city council is about to make this decision. And so Ingris, we'll start with you, then go to John, we'll give the chief the last word. Speak directly to the city council members here. What is the most important thing they need to keep in mind as they approach making this decision about standing up the citizen review panel and what kind of authority it should have and who should be on it? What should the city council members be considering as they make their decision? Ingris, we'll start with you.
I think this is going to be an opportunity to really have an opportunity for the community to be heard. I know it's finally going to be some policy that is really going to be beneficial, that can improve those relationships that are currently existing here in the city of Alexandria. So I think truly hear from the community that is mostly being impacted, which is folks of color.
John, and what's the most important thing for city council members to think about as they're approaching this major decision?
To not view this as a panacea or the only thing. That I think what I heard was a remarkable sort of unity around here about having an open, big set of eyes and looking at mental health, police budget, traffic stops, training, relations with the community. There's a range of things of which a civilian review board is one piece, but it's not the panacea. It needs to be part of a comprehensive sort of review. I think we're at a decent or good place now, but I think we can also get to a much better place.
Chief Brown, I'll give you the last word.
Real quickly, first of all, thank you for having a discussion about this very, very important issue. And my suggestion to the council is we had an awful lot of men and women in this department that do a good job every day. They come to work in COVID, they're exposed, they do things like what happened today just to kind of, get through the day and survive. We have our issues, we have had our issues historically, and as John points out, we may whatever you decide, do it deliberately with the acknowledgement of the good work that the men and women here do, and with the commitment from us that we will continually improve relations with our community and make sure whatever we're doing is indeed right. I do believe, as John does, that there's no single magic bullet that's going to do that. But that has to come from a commitment, and it has to come from a long-standing, a lot of hard work, and it isn't going to be easy. But I do also believe that the community has to be involved in it, and it's got to be a community larger than just a few of us here on this call. It has to be a lot of folks being willing to come in and establish those relationships and feel comfortable. It's their police department, not my police department.
Okay, so I said the chief would have the last word, but I forgot to call on Sarah. So Sarah, last word or closing thoughts or things city council members should be thinking about as they approach this decision?
Well, I think John is exactly right that this is not a silver bullet. This is not something that's going to fix everything. But I think looking at this as a ship that you build as you sail it, and also that as they start doing their work, they are going to start advising what else they need to be doing, as well as what else needs to be done within the city. And that is the ultimate goal of this board, is that it susses out information. It gives us, it advises us on what it's learning, and that then it can be actionable, not just in things like discipline or
I think we might have lost.
That there are actionable things that can be done throughout the city and throughout our efforts here in Alexandria.
Great. Well, this has been a really illuminating discussion. I'd like to thank all the panelists, and I'd like to thank all the folks at Agenda Alexandria for making this happen. And thank you for joining us. Keep in mind, we will be continuing these. We're going to have another virtual session next month. And then eventually, I'm hoping we'll meet up in person someday, I hope. Whenever that is, we look forward to seeing you then. And thanks for watching.